We often have lots of questions about Revelation. What are some of the things that confuse you about Revelation, or that you have questions about? Don't be shy.
All the weird stuff in it, it's just like...
Weird stuff.
Yeah.
Say more.
And, okay, the 7 lampstands and the 7 stars were explained right here, but there's other things that, I don't know.
Lots of images that
Lots of images.
very puzzling.
Very puzzling.
Yes, you're right, absolutely.
And what the whole, what the whole reason is for that book and what it's all about. I saw a friend of mine yesterday, and I noticed that he has a very interesting tattoo on his cap.
Yeah.
The back of his cap. It was of a lion. And then above the lion it said Revelation 5:3-6. And I went and read that, and there was something about the Lion of Judah and then the Lamb of God.
Yep.
So he was telling me all about this.
That's next week.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So it's kind of almost fantasy-like Revelation, right? Full of all these vivid images. And we're not quite sure what to make of them all. Most people aren't. And I think the confusion that people have about Revelation comes from, mainly, from 2 different things. One is that it's written in a style, a literary genre, that's not familiar to us. Very familiar to the people who were alive when it was written, to John's audience, John the author, but completely foreign to us. And so we don't understand what to expect when we read it because we don't know what this genre is about. And I think the other reason people get confused about Revelation is because we hear lots of different interpretations in popular culture. And a lot of these interpretations that we see in popular culture. So let's think of a couple different series or television books or television shows that deal with Revelation. The ones that I thought of is there's a series called the Left Behind novels. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. They're all about the end of the world, right? And they claim to interpret the book of Revelation. There's also a television series that a friend of mine really likes that's a little more contemporary called Supernatural. And it's about these 2 brothers who are living in the end times, and all of these different characters and fantastical creatures from the book of Revelation make appearances throughout the show. And a lot of these interpretations that we see in popular culture are based on a kind of faulty theology. This theology has its roots really pretty recently in the 1800s. A pastor whose last name was Darcy came from England. He reinterpreted Revelation based on a young woman's vision during a healing service in Scotland. And in this young woman's vision, she saw that Jesus returned 2 times at the end of the world. Not just once, but 2 different times. And so John Darcy, this pastor, he took this vision and he used it to create this whole framework of interpreting Revelation. And basically what he said is that Revelation is kind of like a code. And it tells us exactly when to expect the end of the world and how it will happen. And so according to this pastor, there's 7 different ages throughout the whole of history. And if you can interpret when these ages will happen, then you can know when the end of the world will be. And then when the end of the world comes, just like this woman's vision, Jesus will come twice. He'll come the first time, and he'll spirit away all of the believers, or rapture them. That's another word that's used. And all of the non-believers will be left on earth to suffer for a certain amount of time until he comes back for the second time. And that's this theology that a lot of these popular culture shows, books are based on. But that's not at all what John had in mind when he was writing this. So who's John, first of all, right? John is a prophet. He likely traveled around and shared his message with different communities of Christ, different congregations who believed and followed Jesus. We have reason to believe, because of his audience, that he was most likely traveling around in Asia, which is actually Turkey today, would have been the area of Turkey. And these 7 churches that he listed might have been places that he'd stopped before and shared his message. And John believed that Jesus Christ had come and had already started to break in and bring in God's kingdom. And that the present broken era was moving towards this transition and a new beginning where the current powers, which at that point were the Roman Empire, would collapse and God's true kingdom would arise on earth. And so that's part of what he's unfolding in this vision, is that idea that God is coming soon, the time is near, we heard, and that God is going to come and assert God's power and make the world over as God envisions it. So he writes this book, right? And this book is written in a very particular genre, and the genre is actually called apocalypse. What do you usually think of when you hear apocalypse?
I think it's something really scary.
Scary. What do other people think of? The end.
The end.
What else do we think of?
Movie.
The movie.
The Four Horsemen.
The Four Horsemen. Yeah, what do they do with the Four Horsemen?
I don't remember, but I just know it always seems scary to me.
They're bad news, right? Yeah. So the Four Horsemen come, they're bad news, it's the end, all kinds of violence,
Right.
usually a big conflict, explosions. Right, yeah, the end of the world, doom.
Yeah.
Is sort of the things that we associate with apocalypse. But apocalypse actually literally means an unveiling. And the apocalypse genre is about unveiling the truth of what's going on in the world, in the present, and showing what God's true purposes are for the world. And the apocalypse genre involves a very specific kind of sequence. It's like science fiction. When you read a science fiction book, what do you expect? Well, usually you take some element of our present day, right? Say, for example, the fact that the nuclear arms race, right? And then you shake it and put it into the future and imagine what would have happened if things got really out of control, right? That could be a science fiction book about if there were a nuclear holocaust and everybody is underground and trying to survive. That would be a science fiction book, right? And we're reading it, we understand that this isn't a prediction of what is actually going to happen, but it functions as a kind of warning that if we continue in a certain path, that these are the things that could happen, right? Well, the apocalypse functions in a similar way. And a main feature in the apocalypse is the visionary journey. And John, the writer, is the one who has the visionary journey in the book of Revelation. And the visionary journey is, it can travel to any different place, all over the world, up into heaven, down into the underworld. You can travel across time, into the past, through the present, into the future. And usually there's a guide who's taking you along this journey. And then you're seeing all of these fantastic images, which is what Sherry was talking about. It's different scenes of battles, coronations, fantastic creatures. And when you come back from the visionary journey, then you have a message to share. Something about what has been revealed in this visionary journey. And that's what John is going to share at the end. So, very strange for us to kind of wrap our head around. There is, however, one parallel, or one example in modern literature that parallels this genre. And that is A Christmas Carol, if you think about it. So, how many people here are familiar with A Christmas Carol? A lot of people. So, what does the Christmas, explain to me how it goes. Who's the main character?
Scrooge.
Ebenezer Scrooge. And what's his problem?
He's a miser, and one night is the ghost of his
So you're getting ahead. But his problem is that he's a miser,
He's a
right?
miser, he's really miserable and.
Greedy.
Yeah, greedy.
Selfish. Doesn't think of other people. Right. That's his problem. And Terry started to go into the next part. So what happens to Ebenezer Scrooge in this tale?
He basically has a vision at night. See, he thinks it's an upset stomach or something that he ate.
Right, but he has a visionary journey. Yeah, okay. So in this visionary journey, first he goes to what? The past. The past, right? And there's the ghost of Christmas past, right? Because this all takes place during Christmas. And the main beef is that he has no Christmas spirit, because he's so miserly and selfish, right? So the Ghost of Christmas Past takes, and what does the Ghost of Christmas Past show about Jesus Scrooge?
His childhood.
His childhood, all these different scenes from his own life, from his childhood, from when he was a young man, and we get to kind of learn about the fact that way back in the past, he wasn't always a miser, was he? No, he was a good guy, yeah. So we learn about his sister Fanny, and how much she cared for him and he cared for her, and how he had kind of a difficult relationship with his parents. We learn about when he first came into his profession, how generous his initial boss was to him. And then we learn as he kind of gets absorbed in his work, how people who love him, including his love interest Belle, and his own family sort of become estranged from him as he becomes more and more selfish and more focused on his career. And then his present. What's going on in his present? Who works for him?
Bob Cratchit.
Bob Cratchit, right? And what's Bob Cratchit? What's his trial? What's his deal? Working for Scrooge, right? Yeah.
Scrooge doesn't pay him enough.
He's poor.
His family.
Yeah, so Scrooge doesn't pay him enough to support his family, and what's the main tragedy for the Cratchit family? The little boy, right? Tiny Tim, who is Isabel thinks this is very funny. Tiny Tim is very ill, right? And the family doesn't have enough money to give him proper treatment. And he also gets to see like some different areas of the world where initially in the beginning of the film, he's critiquing a pair of men who are trying to help people who are in need. And then he sees how bad the conditions are for those who are in workhouses and who are poor and who are struggling. That's part of the Christmas present. So then he goes on a third journey. And what's the third journey? Christmas yet to come, right?
What's going to happen if he continues with this?
Right, what's going to happen if he continues? Kind of like science fiction, right? The warning. This is the warning part. So what are some of the things that he sees are going to happen? What's going to happen to Bob Cratchit's family?
Tiny Tim dies.
Tiny Tim dies, right? What else is going to happen? What's the main part of the Christmas feature? I mean, Scrooge is going to die, right? Yeah. Alone, yeah. And are people coming to his funeral to wish him well? To say how great he was? No. People all say he was a miserable guy. Good riddance, exactly. Yes. So, what happens at the end? He has a revelation. He repents. Notice this religious language that we're using. And he turns around, right? So we're going to watch a little clip today. And this isn't actually A Christmas Carol. This is from a version of The Christmas Carol, put out in the late 80s called Scrooged. How many are familiar with the movie Scrooged? A few. So instead of Ebenezer Scrooge, the main character is a man called Frank, who's a television executive, has the same problems as Scrooge. He's very greedy. Over his life, he's estranged himself from all the people who love him because of his greed and his selfishness. In place of Bob Cratchit and his family, he has a personal assistant. Her name is Grace. And her son, who's kind of like the Tiny Tim equivalent, has some mental health issues because he saw his father killed. So he hasn't spoken since his father was killed. His son, Calvin is his name. And then he also has the love interest. Her name is Claire. And the same thing happens where Scrooge becomes so enveloped in his work that he becomes estranged from Claire. And eventually he tells her in the present time in the movie that she should abandon her work because she's dedicated to the poor. And we kind of see how that unfolds. And then also they're in place of the nephew, Scrooge's nephew, his Fanny's son, his sister's son, is a brother, and his name, James. His name is James. So James the brother, we see him featured in this sequence too. So I will give you the warning. This is Bill Murray. He's a little crazy. And the end is a bit scary. It's a bit scary because there are scenes from Revelation, as Terry said, that are a bit scary. So the end is a bit scary, and he does say the word hell 2 times, okay? Hell, it's just hell. We'll say that a little bit, or maybe we won't today, but we say that in our Apostles' Creed, okay? So he gets upset at the end, because again, this is all moving towards repentance, turning around, right? So we'll watch this sequence. We're ready. So this is Frank.
God, aren't you supposed to be in the studio? We're all the air. Hey, back off, big man. They work with the chicks, but not with me. Is this strict? Man?
So who's this? It's the ghost of Christmas yet to come, right?
We're gonna get phone calls.
So here's the journey. And this is the first scene. So there's his personal assistant with her son, Calvin.
I just got here.
We have to go.
Merry Christmas, Calvin. I'll see you.
Now, this is just possible future, right? I mean, this is still, I know the head of pediatrics said, everyone, we can get this kid out of here right away. This is not enough. I'm all over it, don't worry about it.
So here's scene 2. This is Claire, the woman that he loved.
Will you look at that? Where did they come from?
Hey, you! Beat it!
She, you?
Will you? Look at those filthy little creatures. We need to...
Oh, Claire.
Okay.
Claire. They're just children.
Please, darling, don't tell me. I wasted 20 years of my life on pathetic little creatures like those. Finally, thank God, a friend of mine said to me, scrape them off, Claire. You want to save somebody. Save yourself.
Sorry, Claire.
Thanks a lot, Lumpy.
So that was what she called him, Lumpy.
That was lousy.
So this is the final scene.
Wendy? Oh, no. James.
So that's his brother's wife, and he thinks that the coffin is his brother.
Why did this have to happen? No, I didn't back on it. Lily, it's James!
So now he knows it can't be his brother in there, right?
Who's in there? What is my shirt? What the hell is this you said? Mother have died?
That's his name.
Why are you showing me this stuff? We can't do anything yet. Why the hell did you bother to show me this stuff? James, no. Please, calm down. Jimmy, don't let him burn me. Please don't let him burn me.
coffin, and he goes, so the whole premise of the movie is that he's this executive, and he's making all of his workers do a live version of A Christmas Carol on Christmas Day. Just like ultimate miserly thing to do, right? So they can be with their family. So after he breaks out of the coffin, he's back in his office, and he goes and he makes up with everybody, and there's a happy ending, of course. So just so you know, he doesn't get burned alive. But what's the point, right? Why all this scary imagery? What does it mean? It's showing him he needs to change his ways. So we saw different scenes unfold here. The first one was his personal assistant and her son, who in the present time was just not speaking because of his father's death. And then what unfolds, because she can't get help for him, is that he ends up where? In an asylum. That's right, again. And so what is Scrooge's response when he sees it? It's a little hard to understand what he's saying, but what is his response? I know people. I'll fix this. I'll make sure that he gets the help he needs. And then, I'm all over it, yeah. Then the second scene is his love interest, Claire, right? And what's the scene unfold there? So in the present time, he had told her that she needs to stop her charity work and just care for herself. And how did that unfold? What do we see? So there's 3 kids that are starving, and what's her reaction? Disgust. Get rid of them, right? And that's because of what he said to her, right? And then the final scene, of course, the climax, and this is straight from the Christmas Carol. What happens? He sees his own funeral, his own coffin, and then to make things even more dramatic, he's inside the coffin when it's going into the furnace to be cremated, which doesn't happen. Okay. But the point is that all of this scary imagery has a purpose, right? And what's the purpose? To turn around, right? And that is what's behind some of the scary imagery in Revelation 2. So John's vision, that we're going to hear different parts of throughout the next week, is ultimately, as scary as some parts can be, as confusing as some parts can be, it's ultimately a vision of hope. For those who have fallen away from the faith, John says there is still hope for you, there is still time to turn around. Just like Frank from this film, or Scrooge from the original Christmas Carol, there's still time. That's Jacob Marley, who comes in the original tale, right? There's still time for you to turn around and to embrace the generosity of the Christmas spirit, to stop being so selfish. And that's exactly the message John has for his audience. There's still time for you to return to the faith and to be faithful to God and to leave behind those things that you have replaced God with. And then the other message of hope is for those who have been faithful. So John's message is a little different than the Christmas Carol because it's for multiple people. The message here is just for Scrooge, basically. But John's message is for the whole church. And so the other part of the message is that for those who have been faithful, the hope is that, yes, now in the present you are struggling against these powers that seem so overwhelming, the Roman Empire. But God is ultimately in charge. And God ultimately has a future of healing and justice in mind for you and for all of creation. So overall, Revelation is about hope. And the hope remains for us too. That there is always time for us to change our lives and to embrace more faithful ways of living. And to leave behind the things that can sometimes control our lives and that we can let take the place of God. And that for those of us who are struggling in the faith, that ultimately God has this hope in mind for us, healing and justice for our world as well. So, that's what Revelation is about. It's not about the end of the world and predicting when and how it exactly will happen. It's about, it functions as a kind of a warning and a consolation. That for those who have fallen away, you can still turn around. And for those who have remained faithful, God is walking with you and is on your side. So, thoughts, questions?
I feel better about it
about it now. All right. That's good. Let's end with a prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the hope that you offer us. We give you thanks that we always have the ability to turn around and to face you, to turn away from those things that are draining us, that are not giving us life. And we also give you thanks that when we struggle, that you are by our side, that you are strengthening us, and that you offer us healing and justice. We pray that you would continue to walk with all of us as we go from this place, as we do your ministry, as we follow your call. As we, the church, try to embody the life of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.